Now, it's my delight to be able to welcome Leon van Omen from Aberdeen. How many of you in this room are connected with the Disability and Faith program in Aberdeen in one way or another? All right. Several people with PhDs, a couple of people just beginning. It's probably the largest PhD graduate program in theology and disability around the world, kind of anchored by John Swenson and Brian Brock and some others. And then Leon van Omen had the occasion to be hired as a senior lecturer in pastoral theology and given an office between the two of them. And so it was inevitable that he will be here and working in this area as well as part of God's mysterious ways of calling people. Leon comes from the Netherlands originally, in the Netherlands, born there, in Belgium as well, now lives in Aberdeen, his wife and 2 kids. We got an interesting discussion earlier about the ways people think when they say that, because you don't, in the U.S., you wouldn't introduce somebody as saying they have a wife and 2 children. And there are different kinds of meanings to that. But Leon has been, as he's gotten into this world, has gotten really interested in working in the arena of autism and faith supports and theology and worship. He is co-director with Graham McCacken, who is a New Testament professor, who I know of because my wife is a New Testament professor and have met him, but of this, the only of its kind Center for Theology and Autism and Theology at Aberdeen. And he's been doing work in the last few years, a research project that's led to this book from Baylor Press, Autism and Worship, a Liturgical Theology, which we have a couple of copies upstairs and the display copy if you want to get it. I had the pleasure of hearing Leon earlier this year at Baylor as a visit there for a couple of talks and was really fascinated. And as he comes this morning, I also want to thank the Nancy Lurie Marks Family Foundation here in Boston. And they are represented here this morning by Beth Swick and Dick Denning, if you all would raise your hand. I've worked with Beth the last 5 or 6 years on information that you, I think, have in your packet, but you'll see upstairs, and you may have heard about this online website on autism and grief that's got 3 portals, one for autistic adults, one for family members and other caregivers, and another part for clergy and other kinds of professionals. So it's been really pretty well used. We've got some statistics upstairs about how it's been used in the last few years, and we'd love for you to help us spread the word about that to families and people in autism networks. So without further ado, from across the waters, let me welcome my friend Leon to come and talk with us today.
Thank you. Is this working? Yes? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Bill, for this very kind introduction. It's wonderful to be here. First, I'll do the description of myself before I forget. I'm told that I'm a tall guy. In the Netherlands, I would be very average, but in any other country that I've lived, I'm reasonably tall. I'm white. My hair used to be brown. I would describe it as gray, but my kids really want to point out that it's getting white. I've got blue eyes and wearing a white shirt, and that's it, I think. That has completely thrown me, that description. I already lost what I was going to say. No, it's not entirely true. I wanted to say one more thing in terms of accessibility, and this specifically because I'm working a lot with autistic people. I know that sometimes the way autistic people interact or engage with a lecture is actually by not looking at the speaker, by actually playing a computer game or whatever, if doodling or fidgeting or just walking out for a while. That's everything. That's all absolutely fine with me. I'm not going to be fussed about that. I may be distracted, but probably not. So please feel free to engage in the way that works for you. It's not about me, it's about you. I know what I'm going to say, right? So, okay. All right. With that, let's see. Oh yeah, one more brief comment. I'm using a slightly updated version of the PowerPoint, so you can download the PowerPoint and point slides. I made a couple of tweaks, nothing substantial, but there you are. Okay, good. Can everyone understand me okay? Hear me okay? Is my accent not throwing you off? It's a little bit closer to the mic. Oh, this works. Now I can hear myself as well. Cool. All right, is this better? Okay, whenever you can't hear me, just give me a shout, okay? Good. Folks, I want to talk to you about some, well, in a way, very much following on from what Karen was saying about belonging, because at the heart of my talk is also that question of belonging. I won't necessarily call it exactly the same, but I want to look at you, at the core of the talk really, and the core of my book on which this is based is, why is it so difficult for autistic people to belong very often? No, let me put that differently. Why is it so difficult for communities to make their spaces where autistic people can belong? That's really at the heart of the problem, I think. And I also want to offer some thoughts as a theological response to that. So that's the heart of the talk. So if you now want to switch off and do something else, it's fine. You've heard it, right? That's the core argument. All right. Now let's make this one work. All right. Now, before we talk about problems, let me just open with a story of a church who got it right, so to speak. And this is the story of Matt. Matt is like all the names of the stories that I'm going to tell. This is an anonymous, like anonymized, so it's a fictitious name. That's the word. All right, let me just read this. Then, although he, that's Matt, held his hand over the offering basket, so sorry, I should give some context. So this is coming out of a research project where we try to understand how non-speakers or non-speaking or minimally speaking autistic people engaged with church. And so my then research assistant, Hannah Kundil, she is now, she has her PhD, moving on with postdoc. She did this particular participant observation. And so she went with Matt and his caregiver to a Roman Catholic church. That's the context. So then in the service, although he held his hand over the offering basket for a long time, it seemed that Matt could not direct his fingers to uncurl and release the coins in his palm. The steward with the basket waited very patiently, unperturbed by the delay. She was obviously used to Matt and accommodated the delay without any fuss. Eventually, when it became apparent that Matt was stuck, Matt's carer helped Matt to start uncurling his fingers. I just love this story because here is an autistic person who wanted to engage, and it became very clear that in different ways he wanted to engage. And here also, he wanted to put the coins in the offering basket. And here is an example of a steward not being rushed, but just understanding Matt, knowing Matt, and therefore she just waited patiently. It was fine. The carer likewise, the carer did not step in immediately, rushing Matt because, liturgy needs to move on. There was just a patient, and the whole community, Hannah observed, was just fine with that. Isn't that wonderful? I wished my whole presentation was like stories like that. It's not. But this is a great story to open with, isn't it? All right, so in order to be a little bit on the same page, what is autism anyways? Now, yeah.
Hey, Leah, I'm sorry, but do actually do something. But when you are talking about the slides, can you give a image description? Yeah. quickly. Is that okay?
All right, I've got a lot of slides, so this, this is going to, that's all right. No, because I heard then you're an expert, so that's why I have a lot of slides. That's what you said, no? All right. Okay, so the story that I just read out was on the slide, the story by Matt, and now I've got a slide with written on it, what is autism, with a big question mark, because that depends on who you're asking, and that's the next slide. Who do you ask? And so I'm going to read from the slide. Autism is ... is a suspicious statement. So, are you, 3 bullet points here on the slide? Are you going to ask someone who makes an official diagnosis? Then you get a clinical answer, a clinical perspective. Are you going to ask someone who works in professional services? You get a different perspective again. Or are you going to ask #actually autistic people? Then probably you will get, again, a quite different answer, right? So what is autism is not as straightforward a question as you think it might be. Next slide. So very briefly, the diagnostic criteria of DSM-5, they're written here on the slide. So that is, if you want to get an official diagnosis in the United States, then this is what is going to be used. Across the world, it's either this one or the ICD-11, which is very, very, very similar to DSM-5. Okay, so I'm just going to read the first 2 criteria. A, persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts. And B, restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. Okay, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Now, if you ask professional services, here's the definition that I found from Scottish Autism. Scottish Autism is the biggest professional service in Scotland, providing care for autistic people. And this is what they write on their website. Autism is a lifelong developmental condition that affects the way a person communicates, interacts, and processes information. It sounds very different from the DSM already, right? Do you hear that? Okay, let me continue on the slide. There are more than 1 in 100 autistic people in Scotland. Every autistic people has skills, talents, aspirations. While some people will have subtle differences in their thinking and processing style, others will have more complex needs requiring more intensive support. A very different take almost, right, on autism. Okay, then thirdly, if you ask autistic people themselves, a couple of bullet points here on the slide. First of all, we often speak about the autistic community as if there is any such thing. So I think it's better to speak about autistic communities, plural. And even then, I don't think that necessarily each autistic person that I know identifies as I belong to the autistic community or a autistic community. So it's a little bit, I'm a scholar, I'm a researcher, so I like that kind of nuance that we need to be a little bit careful when we say the autistic community says this. Well, some people will say that, but not necessarily all. However, with that caveat in place, what you will hear from the autistic community is that they often push back against the medical model. Think about the DSM-5 again. What was it? It is, I need to remind myself, persistent deficit. Oh, wait a sec. So autism is a deficit? Well, a lot of autistic people will push back against that. It's not a deficit, or it's certainly not only a deficit in social communication, social interaction. Restricted repetitive behaviors, restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. Well, again, to say that something is restricted is a value judgment. So from the autistic community, you get pushback and say, well, you know what? I've got a nice story here. Learned that from you, telling stories. So I know an autistic boy. I think this story happened when he was about 7, 8. And oh, this is so stereotypical. I shouldn't do this. But he is like the train spotter, right? Your typical autistic interest in trains. And He's back in Belgium, and he knows every train that travels in Belgium. It's incredible. And at one point, I think it was a year ago or 2 years ago, there was a really special train, international train, that was going through Belgium. And that was such a lovely occasion, so rare. And his mum, bless her, took him to do the train spotting early in the morning, whenever it was. And before that train passed, of course, a lot of other trains passed. And with every train that was coming, he was the first to shout, "Oh, it's this type, it's that type." And honestly, there were a lot of adult train spotters, and they were really impressed by this little boy. Is that restricted? Is that restricted interest? Or is it just a delight? I don't know. For me, that's a delight, right? Okay. So often, so back to the slide with the actually autistic voices. So they push back against that medical understanding as a deficit. Often autistic people will embrace the so-called social model of disability. I'm not going to explain that now. I assume that is known, the difference between medical and social model. And then a step further, slightly different from the social model, is to speak about autism as neurodivergence. So neurodiversity is a slightly different model. And maybe we can say that autism is a gift and not just a deficit. But then, of course, you run into the discussion, is autism a disability or not? The way that with the Center for Autism and Theology, we define this, or I define it at least, and the rest has not told me not to do it that way, is to see autism as parallel to disability. So the autism theology discourse is a parallel discourse. That means there is a lot of overlap between disability theology, but it's not entirely the same. So there will be certain aspects about autism that you can say is disabling, rather from a social model, or maybe also a medical model. If you come to the doctor and you can't explain exactly what is there, because either you can't speak or you don't know how in that situation you need to explain it to a doctor, then that is disabling, right? So, in other words, what is autism? Let's discuss over lunch what that is, right? In my work, I tend to work especially from the views of the autistic community themselves. That's where I start. Because for me, that just makes sense that you do that. Listen to the people that you work with, right? Okay, I'm going to skip this one. Just one more note before I start with something else. Just a note on language. You will be familiar probably, or many of you, with the debate between person-first language, a person with autism, and identity-first language, autistic person. I use, as you will have heard, I will use identity-first language because that seems to be the preference by the majority of people in the autistic community, right? Again, we need to be nuanced here. There will be autistic people who actually prefer a person with autism. That's fine. If you want to replace any identity-first language that I'm using by person-first, fine, go ahead, right? But this is why I use identity-first language. All right. So we started with I need to learn to speak into the mic. So we started with a positive story, the story of Matt. Let me read out a story or part of an interview that I had with Rose, which was quite different. It's so funny. There's a little thing there over the top of the slide. So I think what it says, it starts with, I guess with the music. Yeah, that's it. I guess with the music, said Rose, in the face-to-face church. She also went to an online church, so she's now talking about a face-to-face church. With the music in that church, it very much depends on who is singing it, what they're singing, and if they're aware that they're completely out of tune or not. Because I'm quite good at picking up when people are out of tune. And it can be either really, really nice, especially when you hear the rest of the congregation sing, and that would be a big smile. But if it's really out of tune, overpowered, it's almost like a vomit emoji, because it makes me feel quite ill. So I asked her, like, go through the worship service, what kind of emoji would you kind of stick to each element, which is, by the way, a really nice interview technique, really worked well. And so she didn't know whether that existed, the vomit emoji, but if it does, that was one that she wanted to use. And then she continues, I really can't read what's there, but people think that when I say that it's to do with the music, they think I just don't like music or don't like loud music. This stereotypical example, right? Actually, through another piece of research on the sensory aspect of worship, we found that it's not necessarily the loudness of music, but it's really out of tune that is much more important, or as important. So I'm going to continue to read here from the slides, but it's often when it's completely unbalanced that I find it quite difficult. And it's also kind of volume plus unbalanced, plus also knowing that I've tried to ask for, or I've said that I've got issues, but they just won't change it. So it's all that stuff thrown together. I've highlighted that bit, plus also knowing that I've tried to ask for, or I've said that I've got issues, but they just won't change it. And I'll come back to that several times in this presentation. All right, good. So those were preliminary stories and preliminary notes. You're like, really? Is he only starting now? Yes. Okay. What I would like to talk with you about, and you have this on the outline. There's an outline, I think, that you can download. There you can see the structure of this talk. So first, I want to talk with you about experiences like roses, which lead to the absence of autistic people in worshiping communities, right? I'm going to keep that fairly brief. And I will talk about ignoring as a particular kind of absence. And then I go to the root of the problem, and that's normalcy, I think. And I will spend some time on that. Now, how do we reply to normalcy, the problem of normalcy? How do we reply or respond theologically? Through a theology of presence. And then, like ignoring is a particular type of absence, availability, I will argue, is a particular type of presence. And then I will make some theological notes. I think this is grounded in the kenosis, which I'll come back to that. And in participation, that's the theological grounding for this. And then I will make a note about liturgical theology, which you can't see on the slide here, but it's just behind the two people that you can see on the slide. There's liturgical theology, right? Okay, so this slide gives you an outline of the talk. This is based on my book as well, so if you miss anything and you want to read it, then buy the book. All right, so let's start with absence and ignoring. Attendance of religious services is not uncommon for autistic people. In other words, there are autistic people in your churches, right? Or same for synagogues, mosques, people will be there. However, autistic children are 50 to 70% less likely to attend religious services than others in their age groups, according to one study. And another study asked people, just in general, are you going to church or not, or religious services? People who were not on the autism spectrum, they replied to I never attend religious services. 24.4% said, no, I'm never attending a religious service. Those on the spectrum, that was a percentage of 32.1. In other words, autistic people are saying, more autistic people are saying they never attend religious services than their non-autistic counterparts, okay? These are just a couple of figures just to demonstrate that I'm not plucking this out of thin air. And then, interestingly, that study by Whitehead that I just referred to, he compared several what he called chronic health conditions, in which he included autism. And those on the spectrum participated the least. So compare all kinds of disabilities, autism is down at the bottom in terms of participation in religious services. And also there seems to be a glass ceiling, because even if autistic people participate, what researchers found was that only, I'm reading from the slide, however, only a very small number occasionally led scripture readings, 11%, or public prayer, 13% during these services. In other words, even if autistic people are in church, they tend to be much less involved in any liturgical things, right? So just reading the scripture, leading prayer, doing other stuff. I think in these studies that the researchers talk especially about autism that and with co-occurrent intellectual disabilities. It's not always clear in the studies, but you get a picture, right? Yeah. I'm going to refer every now and then to a book which you see on the slide behind the two people on the slide, on the screen, by Claire Williams. She is a good friend of the center, and she wrote a wonderful book last year, Peculiar Discipleship, an Autistic Liberation Theology. And here, just to drive home what I've been saying, here she says on the slide, I quote, "For a liberation theology of autism, practices of the church should be recognized as insufficient to meet the needs of autistic people at this time." Okay, good. Now, if all of this was too much and you're like, what is he talking about? Then just go to the outline, and there is just a 2-sentence summary, or 1 sentence really, of this first point. Autistic people attend church less than non-autistic people, and even less than people with other disabilities. When they are attending, often their gifts and needs are ignored. That's the baseline summary of this first point. Okay? Are you still with me? Great. All right, now, what is then, why are autistic people less in church than you would expect? I'm talking about church because I'm a Christian theologian, but I imagine similar things would be true for synagogues and mosques and other religious services, although that's not necessarily true. I'm very interested to meet people from other religions to talk more about this. Okay, so the problem is normalcy. I start with a quote again here on the slide from another interviewee. I will call her Rachel. And she said, normal people, excuse her language, but this is her language, normal people just go to church and don't think any more about it. They just get in their car or walk, they go through the door, they do the service, and they go home. And it's never that simple for me. Anyone who has listened to my talks before will recognize this quote, because I'm always using it, because this is just driving home the point so much. For neurotypicals, to use that term, they don't think anything about going to church. For an autistic person, it is a massive task often, right? It's never that simple for me. I'm going to read on the next slide a quote by Lenny Davis. Lenny Davis is the author that is associated in disability studies with the concept of normalcy, right? So I'm getting it from Leonard Davis, and then Thomas Reynolds. Many of you will know Thomas Reynolds, his 2008 Vulnerable Communion. He does a lot with that term as well. And in my book, I just try to do even more with that, or in a different way. So, Leonard Davis. To understand the disabled body, one must return to the concept of the norm, the normal body. I would like to focus not so much on the construction of disability as on the construction of normalcy. I do this because the problem, in inverted commas, is not the person with disabilities. The problem is the way that normalcy is constructed to create the problem, in inverted commas, of the disabled person, right? So next slide. I quote again, the problem is not the person with disabilities. The problem is the way that normalcy is constructed to create the problem of the disabled person. So let's apply that to autistic people or autism. The problem is not the autistic person. The problem is the way that normalcy is constructed to create the problem of the autistic person. Does that make sense? So rather than focusing on autism as the problem, what is it about the community that makes autism a problem or the autistic person a problem? Yeah? All right. Now it's going to become a little bit more theoretical. Bear with me. To understand the concept of normalcy, we need to look at belonging. Right there we have that word, belonging. And I'm using here some of the philosophy of Charles Taylor. Now that sounds as if I understand Charles Taylor, and if I understand all the philosophers, I don't. No, you know, especially in academic conference, you get these, sorry, this is completely tangent. You get these presenters and you really get the impression that they know all this stuff, right? And I'm always intimidated by them because I don't know all that stuff, let alone philosophers. So I'm going to work a little bit with Charles Taylor, but as you know, I had to kind of really work very hard to do that. But I think it's very useful, and I'm not trying to show off here like, oh, I understand Charles Taylor. I don't. Or maybe just a little bit, but right. So that was a tangent, but I think it's, you know, let's be honest in conferences that presenters don't know everything. Come on. Right, but this is useful, I think. So Charles Taylor talks about frameworks. And he said, this is where he starts. Okay, you come into this world as a human person, as a human being. And there's other human beings, right? And just the way human beings are, you want to have a good life. Yeah? You don't like suffering, you don't like pain, so you don't like hunger, so you're trying to find food. You don't want to be alone, so you're trying to make friends, right? So all of that creates that longing, or that is that longing for the good, right? So we long for the good in inverted commas. Next bullet point, Thomas Reynolds, again, he also works with Charles Taylor, understands him better than I think, but so I quote from Reynolds here, the good is what we find meaningful about life together. This is important. We always try to work towards that what we find meaningful, and that we find meaningful together, because I may find something meaningful, but if no one else finds it meaningful, it doesn't help me to build friendship and community. So the good includes that sense of belonging, right? And the framework, last bullet point here, the framework which determines what is good is established in interaction with others in community. That kind of sums up what I just said. Yeah? So here's the point. Next slide. In order to belong to the community, then, one needs to align with the framework, with what is deemed good and what is deemed not good or not good enough. In other words, if I want to belong to a community, I need to fit in, right? Thank you. Some people applauding in the background. Yeah. So in order to belong to the community, I need to align with the framework. If I go off and do something completely different, it's not going to work. It's not going to help me to integrate into community, right? Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. It follows, next bullet point on the slide, it follows that if one cannot reach the threshold of what is good, one does not belong. So that framework always serves the majority and therefore inevitably excludes some. Are you still with me? Wow, wonderful. This was the most complex thing of the whole talk, so you'll be fine for the rest of it. So what is normalcy then? How does normalcy come into this whole talk about framework and belonging? Well, here is how I would define normalcy, and sorry for shamelessly quoting myself, but I do define it slightly different than in literature, because normalcy is talked about as a noun, and it is a noun, but it acts like a verb. Hear me out. Normalcy is the set of dynamics, that's why it's a verb, in fact, or acts like a verb. It's a set of dynamics by which communities safeguard the boundaries of what and who they deem normal and therefore acceptable. Those who fall within those boundaries can be integrated into or even belong to the community, but those who do not fall within the boundaries either need to change or will be rejected, end quote. That is, I think, what normalcy is, or how normalcy functions, right? So there's a threshold. If you want to belong to the community, you need to pass the threshold. And if you don't pass the threshold, you will be rejected, or you need to change so you fit in, i.e. autistic camouflaging or masking. Yeah. Now, if you think about, in Western cultures at least, what are the kind of things that that buys you that social capital, so to speak, that helps you to belong? Well, just a couple of words here on the screen in a word cloud. You need to be socially adept. That really works. I also think that extroverts have are just a little bit ahead of the introverts because they do that naturally and it energizes them. I think if you're able-bodied, that really helps in our society. If you're independent, in inverted commas, because no one is independent, but if you're independent, we value that. What else do we value? We value physical beauty. We value if you're able to speak, or speak well in particular, etc., etc. Those are Western values. And if you want to belong to a community, it is incredibly helpful to possess some of these or all of these, right? Do you recognize the picture? Yeah? I would say churches are no different from this. We're just so influenced by culture. And that's not necessarily bad until this becomes exclusionary, right? But I think normalcy, that safeguarding of the boundaries, functions alongside these norms in our churches very often. I'm going to skip that one. All right, back to Claire Williams again, our friend of the center, with her book Peculiar Discipleship. I can't really read the first words, but oh yeah, she is here visiting an Anglican church. She's not from an Anglican tradition. She visits an Anglican church, and there she says, well, and all of a sudden, everyone spun around and shook hands with one another. They greeted one another with much enthusiasm and left their seats to find their friends. This is the moment of the peace. In Anglican liturgy, before the Eucharist starts, people wish each other the peace of Christ. And this is what she's talking about. And every church does a slightly different, but it is this, actually it's a really, really interesting and good description. So everyone get up from their chairs, spun around, shook hands with one another, greeted one another with much enthusiasm and left their seats to find their friends. I didn't have any particular friends. I felt too shy to interrupt these reunions and couldn't quite make out what social dynamics were at play. The spiritual and theological import of this praxis was lost on me. The swirling of other people as they confirmed friendships and greeted new people felt like a repeat of every school lunchtime and classroom instruction to get into groups of 3. I was left standing on the sidelines. That is normalcy at work, right? That is normalcy at work, and it works in the churches as well. And just to close this part of the talk, again, Rose, I've tried to ask for changes, or I've said that I've got issues, but they just won't change it. That is normalcy at work. Okay, so that's the problem. And one more. again, Rachel, normal people just go to church and don't think any more about it. They just get in their car or walk, they go through the door, they do the service, and they go home. And it's never that simple for me because I don't play according to those same rules of normalcy. That was the point about normalcy. I'm going to read the very brief summary in case you missed anything. On the outline you can follow here. Normalcy. Every community has its own norms, values, and rules. You need to comply to these, otherwise you do not belong. Autistic people often cannot keep up with all these norms and rules and therefore are often excluded from church communities. I'm just going to pause for 10 seconds to catch a breath and for you to have some processing time. All right, so how do we respond to this? Again, I'm a theologian, so I was looking for a theological response, but I'm afraid I'm starting with philosopher again. Really not trying to show off. This was hard work for me, but there's a philosopher, Gabriel Marcel, who said a couple of things about presence, which are so good that I want to start there. Because over against absence, we need to talk about presence, of course. And over against ignoring, we need to talk about availability as a particular way of presence. All right. Here's a picture. Just take 10 seconds to look at the picture, and then I will give a description of the picture for those who cannot engage in this way. But for those of you who can, just have a look at a picture and just think about what you're seeing. All right, so this is a picture of two girls on a very old seesaw. And I will tell you when that is taken. It's a black and white picture, by the way. And it's photographed by Jane Brown, a very famous photographer, I've been told. I've learned through looking this up on the internet. And this picture is taken at the Lindens in Surrey, England, in 1966. The Lindens was the first autistic school, or the school for autistic children. And parallel to this is also, or more or less parallel to this, is the founding of the National Autistic Society, which was different called then, but the National Autistic Society is the biggest autistic society in the UK. So, two girls. I got this picture from the front cover of a book by Stuart Murray, which is called Autistic Representation. You see the book cover on the screen here. Culture, Narrative, and Fascination. This is not a theology book at all, but a really, really interesting book. I can really recommend it. And in the introduction to the book, Stuart Murray discusses this picture. And he says, basically what he says, what you see in the picture depends on your theory of autism. So you may think that the girls look really withdrawn. Well, there's a particular view of autism, that people with autism or autistic people are kind of drawn into themselves, are really looking inside, are not interested in social interaction and all of that, which, by the way, I would say is a myth, at least in 99.9% of all the people that I know. But you might have a different view of autism. But the point is, your view of autism determines what you see in the picture. And then he comes to a conclusion that and I read this like 5 years ago or something like that, and ever since that has been foundational in my own thinking. Then he says, but whatever your view of autism is, the girls are present. They're there. It's a very, very basic observation. But it got me thinking, it's profound. The girls are there. Okay. What does that mean? What does it mean that the girls are present? What does it mean that autistic people are present in our churches? are autistic and non-autistic people present towards each other? So let's start thinking about presence here. So here's Gabriel Marcel, this philosopher that I work with, French philosopher, lived from 1889 to 1973. Here you see a picture of him, a black and white picture. And he says, I quote from one of his works, he gives an example of an encounter between two people. And then he says, he understands what I say to him, but he does not understand me. He makes me in some sense also a stranger to myself. I am not really myself while I am with him. This is what Rose's experience was in her church. She asked for accommodations. And here the quote is again here on the screen from Rose. I tried to ask for changes, or I've said that I've got issues, but they just won't change it. And what Gabriel Marcel is saying is, so there is this interaction, and Rose was present in the church, the leaders were present in the church, they were talking to each other, but the leaders were not really present to Rose. Because they said they understood her, but they didn't understand her. Right? That is what is happening here. They didn't understand her. And in a way, it can make Rose feel a stranger to herself. I don't know whether that happens in this case, but you can easily imagine that this kind of almost denial is, or maybe even gaslighting, is making you a stranger to yourself. You start doubting yourself. Like, oh, maybe I'm just the wrong one. Maybe I should just change. Maybe it's just me. Maybe it's, you become a stranger to your own experience, right? There's the disconnect. That's what's happening when you're not present to each other. But, quoting Marcel again here on the slide, the opposite phenomenon, however, can also take place. When somebody's presence does really make itself felt, it can refresh my inner being. It reveals me to myself. It makes me more fully myself than I should be if I were not exposed to its impact. So this is the opposite, right? So here's Rose again on the next slide. It is validating experiences. Presence can validate, being present to each other can validate one's experience. So Rose says, I quote, I guess if there's kind of areas of conversation kind of set up between people and someone comes forward and it hasn't worked, in other words, it's a little bit complicated what she says. You basically, if there's a new idea, she says, and you tried something out, and then someone comes forward and it hasn't worked, rather than going, well, that's just how it was, kind of be ready to listen and be ready to hear people out and not go, well, you've just all made that up. But actually listen and kind of engage with and empathize. I'm using these quotes from the interviews to show that it does happen. This is not just theory what I'm talking about. This is an instance where real presence can happen. It didn't happen for Rose, but she says it could. Actually listen and kind of engage. That's what we're talking about. All right, now, one step further then. Presence as availability. So Gabriel Marcel speaks, he is French, so forgive me my French, he talks about disponibilité and disponibilité, which means kind of availability and non-availability. Now, Gabriel Marcel himself says that that's a very flat translation of the terms that he uses in French, therefore I use the French. It means like being at one's disposal, as it were. Disponibilité, right? It's not disposal as like we can do without, but disposal like I'm really at your disposal. That's what he's talking about. So, availability as disposability. And then he says, this is a really, really strong statement that he makes. He says, you can think about availability as belonging in the following sense. Quote, Jack, I belong to you. This means I'm opening an unlimited credit account in your name. You can do what you want with me. I give myself to you. Now, that's really, really radical. But that's what Marcel wants us to think about. Can we be so radically present towards each other? And of course, this is very open to abuse, but it's not in Marcel's theory, because mutuality is assumed, in which freedom is found and which leads to growth. In other words, it's not just me being available to you, but you also to me, right? And so there's a mutuality and there's community. I don't think any one of us can do this on our own. I think it takes a community. We need that one person who believes in us, but it still takes a community, right? So availability means to turn outwards, to turn towards the other, instead of turning inwards and looking inside. Another interviewee said, that's on the slide here, if church members were reaching out a little bit to people on the autistic spectrum and saying, you know, we get you, that would be nice. I think he is talking about presence. Can you just be present to me? You don't need to understand me fully, but just listen to me, empathize. Value me, value my experience. And just that little bit of, I get you. That would be nice. All right, I see. Until when do I have? Until 12? Can somebody confirm 12? Yeah? Okay, good. So I need to hurry up, sorry. All right, so that's I'm just halfway my talk. Presence and availability as a response to absence and ignoring. How does that look? What does that look like theologically? And I need to be quick with this. Just buy the book if you want to know more. Okay, so I'm getting this from a well-known passage from Philippians 5 to 11. And I'm going to read that for you. It's on the slide. In your relationships with one another, St. Paul says, have the same mindset as Jesus Christ, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing. This is where the word kenosis comes from. Making yourself nothing. Emptied himself is not a translation. Yeah, that's kenosis. So rather, Christ made himself nothing, and therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Now there is a lot in this passage, and I just don't have the time to unpack that for you. But let me just make a quick couple of notes. First of all, this is soteriological narrative. And why I stress this is, very often this passage has been read and is still being read in churches as an ethical instruction. Have the same mindset as Christ. You need to do likewise, right? And it becomes kind of, you have to do this, you have to do that. And we turn religion into a set of rules. Now, whenever we turn religion into a set of rules, I think we're missing something. At least as a Christian theologian, I would dare to say we miss the entire point, right? So this whole passage is about God wanting to be in relationship with people. God not giving up on the creation and therefore sending God's Son, Jesus Christ, who emptied himself, kenosis, became present, became available in Marcel's terms, right? That is what's happening in this passage. That's not an ethical instruction, right? That's something else. And so when Paul says have that same mindset, we need to make sure that we don't translate mindset in a 2024 Cartesian way. The mindset here is really a whole way of being. It's not thinking the same. The Greek here really means like the way of being. Have that same way of being, that same being present towards each other. So imitating Jesus Christ then is grounded in Christ's participation in humanity. So Christ descended, if you want, became a human being, emptied himself, right? He became a human being, became present to humanity, to creation. when Paul says have the same mindset, have the same way of being, that is grounded in Christ's participation in humanity, and now we're invited to participate in Christ. Right? Again, it's not an ethical imperative, it is your identity becomes aligned or grounded in Christ. Again, I realize I'm speaking as a Christian theologian here. I'm really curious to hear from people from other religions how you hear this. So therefore, being present or available to one another is grounded in God's availability to creation in Christ. It starts with God. And therefore, availability is a gift from God. Right? Theologically, this is really important because otherwise it becomes a burden that we have to do in the community. It becomes an ethical imperative again, right? So theologically, this is a really important move, even though it might sound abstract. So, whereas normalcy, remember what was normalcy? That safeguarding of the boundaries, what you have to do in order to belong, that's criterialism, as Susan Eastman says. Criterialism, by the way, sorry, slide description, I've got that overview of the presentation again. And now by normalcy, I have put the word criterialism, whereas the kenosis that we just talked about is a gift. And so the gift contrasts, the gift of the kenosis, the gift of presence, the gift of availability, contrasts the normalcy, the criterialism of normalcy. Does that make sense? At least to a few of you, some of you have kind of, at this point, nah, Leon. All right, good. And then finally, I'm going to talk about liturgical theology, but let me read the summary for presence and availability and kenosis and participation so that you're all up to speed. So, to counter the absence of autistic people in faith communities, members of these communities need to learn to be really present towards each other. Instead of ignoring autistic people, members of faith communities need to be available to autistic people. Instead of being turned in on oneself, turning outwards to the other person. And then continuing with the summary of kenosis and participation. In theological terms, this kind of presence and availability can be called kenosis. Jesus Christ emptied himself, kenosis, in order to give himself fully, that is being available, to humankind. Believers are in Christ, which means that they participate in divine life. Therefore, they can do like Christ and give themselves to others. We've got 4 minutes, so I actually thought I had longer, so that's why my, no, that's not all, this is just like, that's fine. So I'm just going to read the summary for liturgical theology and the rest you can read in the book. That was shameless. Liturgical theology. In our liturgies or worship services, we participate in the ongoing prayer, proclamation, and life of Christ. And I'm quoting Don Saliers, a well-known liturgical theologian there. One of the few liturgical theologians who has also written on disability, by the way. So it's one of the reasons why I quote him. But he's a wonderful person and a wonderful theologian. So we participate in the ongoing prayer, proclamation, and life of Jesus Christ. Following Christ, we offer our prayers to God and go out into the world to act like Jesus did, valuing and loving people, especially those on the margins, and especially autistic people, I would say. I'm just going to stop there. I'm here until Friday, so happy to talk further. Thank you very much.
We've got a few moments for some questions. Questions by someone? Pardon? So right behind you.
Rabbi Ruti Reagan were here this year. She's a past presenter, a rabbi with autism. But it sounds like she's not here this year. I think she would have lots to say.
Yeah.
Thanks again for the presentation. Can you say something very quickly about Eric Carter's work? I don't know if you're familiar with his work on the 10 markers of belonging.
Yes, that's a great point. I'm very aware of Eric Carter's work, and actually, Bill said I was earlier this year at Baylor, and Eric had invited me, so I know Eric. I use quite a lot of his work in my work as well. The 10 markers of belonging, I don't know them by heart, but they're one of the most practical markers of belonging that I've seen in the field, coming out of research. So I think Eric is just wonderfully bridging research with what matters on the ground, as it were. Yeah. I don't know whether that's an answer to your question, but yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so just to repeat for the people online, the lady over there is saying that being present is one of the first markers of the 10 markers that Eric Carter comes up with. Did I use that? I read it alongside my work here. I did not necessarily use that to expand on, but I'm aware of it, yeah.
Hello, this is Ben speaking to your left, Leon. Over here. Sweet. Once again, this is Ben. Just a reminder, folks cannot hear you online without the microphone, so when you're engaging in questions, just another accessibility note. We have a question from online from an anonymous attendee, and they're asking, for the presenter, in the example of Rose, how can congregations include autistic people and yet maintain boundaries that help us explain it may not be reasonable to expect all people to sing in tune as an accommodation? At what point do autistic people also have to accommodate others, not in a way of enforcing normalcy, but in being in authentic relationships with other imperfect people? That is the end of the question.
That sounds like 2 questions and 2 great questions. First of all, very briefly about being out of tune. She's, I think, in this examples, particularly referring to if you have like singers with microphones up front, so to speak, who lead the worship, then just, maybe it would be great if they sing in tune. But also, just piggybacking on that a little bit, what we have seen in our research over and over again is just, if your church uses tech, make sure it's used well. And of course, I know churches run on volunteers and all of that, but try to get someone who trains your volunteers, someone who knows how to set up your PA and all of that, because that is really something that throws off people. When people sing out of tune is one thing, but also if speakers are out of tune and the left speaker is louder than the right speaker, those kind of things, we've heard that over and over again in our research that can really throw people. Then the question about, and I really appreciate the question, should autistic people also not accommodate? I don't know what the word exactly was there. It is really about being present to each other, right? And so I focus, and I say that in my book as well, I focus especially on non-autistic people, and I put the burden on the community, on the non-autistic members of the community. That is not because I don't believe that autistic people don't have a role to play. Of course they do, and they should equally be present to non-autistic people. But the burden has been on the autistic people and continues to be on the autistic people so often. And therefore, I think we need to shift that burden. And so that is not, yes, you need to be, it's mutual. It's mutual. But too often, why are the autistic people absent? Back to the start of the presentation. So the burden is on them. No. Let's change that, right? And that's why I emphasize, I should look at the camera, dear questioner. That's why I emphasize the burden on the non-autistic people. Yeah.
Thank you. For me, this brings up the question of disclosure. and the initial entrance of somebody into a congregation, that I think sometimes some of this happens so fast that often someone will sort of try out a new congregation and there's something alienating that happens, and there wasn't even a conversation about it because the person is not known, that it may not be known that they need any accommodation. And I'm wondering if you have ideas about how to sort of get over that initial barrier, which I think is what keeps a lot of people away, autistic and not, when the sort of first entrance doesn't work and then they just never come back.
Wow. Do you have another hour? Then we can speak about it. No, this is a great question. And disclosure is, I think there is even a workshop on disclosure this week. Someone is doing that. I think that's great because that's such a big issue. Of course, the more open we can be in our communities about autism, about disabilities, about whatever it is, the more chance we have that we can talk about that with leadership, with anyone responsible, with other members of the community. However, I'm not going to say, oh, and therefore autistic people should be very open about and disclose their autism the moment they start walking into a church. That is putting the burden again in a very unhealthy way on autistic people. Some people will be very comfortable with that. That's fine, but certainly not everyone. So what I'm arguing for in this presentation, in my book, and in general, is something that will not happen overnight, but I'm arguing for a change of culture. That's what I'm ultimately arguing for. I'm arguing for communities where being present, where being available to each other becomes just a hallmark of the community. And regardless of autism or not autism, just anyone, right? Whether it is because sexual identity or disabilities or whatever it is. And it's not to force some kind of disclosure, because that can be artificial and that traumatizing even. But if we had communities where that was okay. So I'm just thinking about, I'm not trying to be shameless about the center that we have, but what I'm hearing so we meet every Tuesday online with about 10 to 15 people. You can ask some other people who are here as well, who are part of the community. And what I'm hearing from them and others is, this is a community where I feel safe to be my autistic self. And why is that? Because we've created a community there, and of course, by nature of the subject that we are studying, autism, it's easy in a way, but it has become a community over time where we know each other and where it's absolutely fine to say, I'm switching off my camera because I'm really fiddling a lot. But it's also okay to leave your camera on and still fiddle a lot, right? Because it has become that community. Now, of course, it's not a perfect community that we have or whatsoever, but I'm surprised. I'm really amazed, pleasantly surprised that is what it has become for a lot of autistic people. And I've even heard some of our students say, this is the first community where I feel accepted like this, because I've never met that before. Again, it's not to boast about our center, it's just to illustrate, and this is the first illustration that came to mind thinking on my feet here, what might that look like? A community that is really safe, where you can disclose, I'm autistic, and I need your support, but I also have a lot of gifts to bring, right? I hope that answers the question.
I just want to say one more thing. I want to relate to the what you said about Jesus and the openness, the emptiness, that he is the kenosis. You said like this, and there is a very nice midrash from Judaism that a boy came to the synagogue in Yom Kippur. And in Yom Kippur, we are praying and praying and praying, and this child didn't know how to read from the book. So he just took the flute and started to, and everyone at first were very amazed and a little angry. How do you do this? Because we are not allowed to take the something else than praying. But then this is exactly the emptiness, the kenosis, the accepting, the belonging. yes, this is how you belong to here. We are open community. You can do the flute and we can pray, and it's the same, right? So thank you for this.
Think about the question about accommodations. One of the things that relationship to that, I think, is one of the things when we ask that question is we don't realize that people often haven't had the practice that most of us have had. You know, you've got to be able to go and go and go and go again to learn a culture. And that's where I think the hidden curriculum that's often there that we need to be aware of, and that a lot of people will tell you they go to visit a church and nobody says hello to them or something like that. It didn't have anything to do with autism, and they never come back. Help me thank Leon again. He's going to be around.